Get through this jam-packed schedule. We're going to keep going with session 1, which is LID implementation and challenges in the ARB region. Our speakers have their full bios in the presentation, and we're going to start out with the City of Sacramento with Dahlia Fadl, and then we'll have Barbara Washburn, Matt Fries, and Mike Floyd will be doing the dry well guidance. We'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much, Christine. Good morning. I'm Dahlia with the City of Sacramento Department of Utilities. Those of you who know me probably can tell I don't sound the same. I'm recovering from a sore throat, sorry. So I'm a little bit overly medicated, but I think we can get through this together. So there we go. So I wanted to start today's presentation by giving a quick overview of where we're at with the Stormwater Quality Design Manual update process. So the manual covers all of the County of Sacramento, including the smaller incorporated cities within the county. So it includes Sacramento County, cities of Sac, Galt, Folsom, Elk Grove, Rancho, Cordova, and Citrus Heights. We are updating the manual to incorporate numeric LID compliance standards as well as hydromodification management standards. We put out a public review draft for the document back in October of 2017. We wrapped up the public review period in early January. We also conducted a public outreach workshop back in October. We had multiple meetings with the Building Industry Association, Northern California, to go over some implementation challenges and comments. We also intend to have SAM training, which is the Sacramento Area Hydrology tool that helps with the LID and hydromod implementation, and that will be happening in March. If you're interested to sign up, please get one of my cards and email me. We still have space available for people to sign up. So, and then finally, the anticipated implementation date for the new manual is July 1st, 2018. I wanted to quickly go over some implementation considerations and challenges. It is a little bit of a paradigm shift from people, how they designed their projects, how the drainage used to work, how they grade their project and parking lots, how the street design looks now, and things like that. So these are some common I would say challenges or considerations that we need to keep in mind as we implement the new requirements. First, we need to have a mechanism to ensure the long-term maintenance of the LID BMPs. Sounds a lot easier than what it is. So we do have a mechanism for people to do maintenance agreements for private development projects, like Home Depots and Walmarts of the world. We also need to figure out mechanisms to do long-term maintenance on BMPs that we're now going to be building in single-family residential subdivisions, which is something definitely very challenging, whether you have HOA maintenance, whether you have city doing some of the maintenance, how do you even set up the funding mechanism? So things like that. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as we start doing more green infrastructure. Plan early. Early plan is usually important. Like I said, these BMPs do impact how you design the site, how do you design your streets, grading, drainage. So it is very important to try to incorporate the requirements as early as you can. Ask us early on in the process about which requirements are applicable. If people try to show up last minute after they already have draft plans ready to go, that's going to make it very, very challenging. One, to incorporate the requirements in the LID measures, but also it will make it very costly because now you already have, set lots and things like that, and trying to squeeze something in last minute would usually mean using maybe something mechanical or something more expensive than anticipated. So, add more details to improvement plans. These are measures that are people are not used to seeing. whether it's the contractors, whether it's the people out in the field building these. So it's our job kind of upfront at the improvement plan stage to add as much detail as possible. I think it helps avoid confusion during construction. It helps us later in the field to go out and verify that they're being built correctly, and things like that. So it's hugely important that upfront we try to do our job, whether it's on the developer side or the person who's doing the project or on the city side or the public agency, to ensure that the plans have enough details that people know what they're doing when building them. So conducting inspections, again, hugely important. We invest a lot of time planning for these BMPs, designing them, incorporating them into plans, and then we go out to the field and realize it got built wrong, you know. And whether it's on the, you know, again, engineer side, whether it's on the public agency, I think it's a collaborative effort to make sure that they get built correctly. But it is hugely important. And the way to get to that is doing more inspections during construction, making sure that there is a few checkpoints when we go and check on the measure and make sure, you know, whether it's the soil media, the placement of the under drain, things like that. Phases of construction of some of the measures that we're trying to cover all of those. Safety. So safety considerations, especially for LID green infrastructure measures in the public right-of-way. Those have been a challenge, whether it's trying to fit parking, street parking right next to the green features, whether it's, you know, making sure pedestrian safety is there so people don't fall into the planters, putting railings around the planters, making sure they're not too deep, things like that. So even if you kind of have a set, you know, design in mind for how you want to do your green infrastructure feature, some of these safety considerations would impact that design. So I think, you know, keep that in mind early on, because, you know, you might need to be restricted to shallower depth, you know, only a certain footprint, having to provide bench on both sides of your planter for people, you know, like a flat area for people to step out of their cars if needed, things like that. So again, if you plan early, then you can kind of work on all these challenges and make sure you don't run into them later. So the focus of today's presentation is really to go over the city's maintenance verification process. This was a question that, like Maureen said, came up in the last LID conference about how to kind of deal with some of the O&M challenges. It is also a question that came up in a couple of the CASCA presentations at the last CASCA conference. So we're just going to give a quick overview with what we do with our maintenance program. This is very much related to, you know, private development parcels. It does not cover things in the right-of-way, but it kind of gives you a little bit of a taste of what the program looks like. So really quickly, we're going to go over what we do at the plan review phase to make sure that we can set up the maintenance long-term. We'll go over what is the verification process, inspections, which is kind of the fun part, but also the frustrating part, depending on what you run into out in the field. And then inspiration, local examples. Okay. So at the plan review phase, that's kind of the most important phase, because depending on what the project is building and the land use and the threshold, you know, the size of the project, that's what triggers the need to execute a maintenance agreement. Most of the time, that trigger is really for triggering the requirement itself, which then, as a kind of a side effect, requires you to execute a maintenance agreement with the city. The maintenance agreement is recorded with the deed because we want to make sure that in the future, as the owners of the parcel change, that the agreement follows the new owners. Or in a lot of cases, you have a developer upfront that executes the agreement with the city, but you know, a couple of years later, they sell the property to somebody else. So you will definitely want to have that mechanism in place to ensure that it's always there, no matter who the owner is. So the executed maintenance agreement, we require that they get submitted before the improvement plans are approved. That allows us to make sure that we actually get them. a lot of the times, if you work for a public agency, once the project is approved, you really don't have a hammer over people submitting stuff, and they can just totally ignore your request and not even submit one. Or you would have to kind of later in the process, whether it's the occupancy certificate or something else, try to use that mechanism to get them to submit the agreement, which is not ideal. So we ask that the agreement is executed up front. Once we have a final design of what the BMPs look like, obviously, because we do require that you include that information in the maintenance agreement. The exhibits include normal legal stuff like the legal description. Site plan, hugely important. We do not want to get a copy of the parcel map. That does not help us any. We actually want a smaller version of the site plan, whether you just make a copy of your grading sheet or any other sheet that you think would have the appropriate information. So we want to know the exact location of the BMPs. We want you to delineate those BMPs, and we want to be able to use that site plan later when we go out to do the inspections to pinpoint where the BMPs should be, and also the number of BMPs. So, if the site plan shows 5 swells and we go out to the site later and we see only 2 swells, that's a problem, right? So that's why these site plans are quite important. And then finally, O&M guidance, which for a lot of the BMPs in the manual, we literally have a table that people can copy that includes the typical O&M expected maintenance information. So, all right. The annual maintenance verification process. So we basically send out letters to all site owners that have these BMPs on site. We have a database that tracks the BMPs and as well as the owner information. We update that on an annual basis, and we use that database to create the letters that we then send out. We give people about a month or so to respond. And then we send a second round of letters to the non-responders, obviously. And then from there, we kind of narrow down the list of the sites we want to inspect. Ideally, if you have the resources, you want to inspect all of them. We don't necessarily have the resources to do that, so we narrow it down to the non-responders, the one that submit maintenance information that looks a little shady or things like that. So, and that's how we come up with the inspection list. Submittal examples, we actually have a template form for vegetated swales, for example, that we send out with letters to sites that have swales, and all they have to do is fill out the form as well as attach photos and things like that. So whenever we can, we try to help people out up front, giving them more guidance on what they need to submit. There's also people who use, companies that do much more, sophisticated reporting. So the other example that has do I have a pointer here, right? Yeah. So the one that has the yes and no, this is one that a site submitted that was developed by a consultant that they used. And so they basically have this kind of, for each of the swales on site, they have a yes or no table as well as photos to go with it and things like that. So you can do, as long as you're able to convey the same information we're asking for from our form, you can be creative and submit what you want. So we review all that when it comes in and make sure it's all correct and looks fine. I would say, similar to how we deal with our kids when they say they've done their homework, you want to trust but verify. So, we want to trust that people are, doing their due diligence and they're submitting correct information, but it also doesn't hurt to do some checking. So we do, on an annual basis, select a certain number of sites that we inspect that, just to make sure the information submitted is correct. Mostly, I would say if I had to pick, it would be sites that we haven't inspected before because it's a new project that just, got finished with the construction, things like that. So, so now I'm going to go over some inspection photo examples, and we're going to cover good, bad, and ugly. These are examples of good inspections, and when I say follow the raindrop, basically you want to make sure that the curb openings where the runoff is supposed to flow into your swales and green infrastructure has no obstructions. You want to make sure that nobody, puts too much cobbles and block that flow. Overgrown grass, that's very common. Things like that. So that's kind of one of the first things we look for when we go out to the site. Okay. Inspection is good. So these are photos of vegetated swales. And although some people are kind of starting to call these traditional green infrastructure, they're very reliable. We've done them for a long time. Applicants as well as agency staff, we know what works, we know what doesn't. And that in itself is huge. So I would say don't discount swales. And now to kind of make a more of an LID feature, we're asking people to incorporate amended soil layer into it to kind of promote more retention of the flow as well as treatment. Inspection's bad. These are all examples of swales where people tried to do 10-year flow conveyance as well as water quality treatment. Looks great on paper. The plans are probably going to be fine. The minute we build them out, people quickly realize if you don't set your outlet structure to get rid of the water quality flows, within the 7 to 9 minutes, and you set your outflow structure to basically for your 10-year event, then all the smaller events end up just sitting at the bottom of the swale, ponding, and because of that, we start getting either vegetation growth that is not intended and becomes an issue, or you actually have dead grass because there's way too much water and it's wet for too long. So I would definitely advise against doing that design. Inspection's bad. Again, whether it's lack of vegetation because people stop watering, and of course we always get the city told us to save water. Right. We still want you to save water, but we definitely do not want to completely kill the grass and turn this into a dirt swale, because now we're creating pollutants and we're creating muddy runoff that goes into our drainage system instead of actually filtering and cleaning it. We also have, vegetation overgrowth, that sort of stuff. And that's where the site plan becomes huge, because then you can use that to try to see what's going on with the site. Okay, I'll go a little faster. Inspection's bad. Again, you want to make sure that there is no vegetation overgrowth or stuff that's impeding where the flow is supposed to go into the green features. Inspection's ugly. Again, that's a couple of examples where people supposedly thought they maintained well, in this case, it's the contact underground filter. And then when we go out and inspect it, it looks awfully like, they haven't maintained it in like 5 years. And so again, it comes back to you want to verify the information that you receive. There's also sometimes innocent mistakes where people go out and clean the wrong device. So when we go out and do that face-to-face interaction, they say, oh, well, I just cleaned this manhole right here. And then you go, well, that's not exactly what we wanted you to clean. It's the other one in the back. And then they go, oh, right. So the inspections are great for educational purposes as well. Another example of a unit that was missing because it was under a huge container for a couple of years. And finally, they were able to find it after we kept bugging them with letters and went out and inspected a couple of times. And finally, they found it and cleaned it. And it had a bunch of built up sediment in it. So, success stories. This is building side planter out at the new Rayleighs on Howe Avenue and Fair Oaks. It looks beautiful. They have the roof leaders going to it. Again, it's an example of how you can use really tight spaces to still do something with your roof enough. And you don't necessarily have to have a big landscaped area around the building. This is the apartment complex that has a vegetated swale that we went out to inspect, but they have these really nice landscaped areas around the buildings where, again, all the roof runoff goes to the landscaped areas as well as the walkways and the impervious areas around it. So perfect example of how we can use those areas to disconnect impervious areas and try to filter some of that runoff before it goes to the drainage system. We're trying to change the look of swales from doing, very heavy use grasses to stuff that will still provide full coverage of your swale area, but use less water. So this is kind of an example of that. I think there is a little bit of in the landscaping area, there's definitely some improvements and evolution for some of that. Disconnected pavement, make your green areas work for you. Don't make it just a useless green area. At a minimum, make it depressed. Allow some of the runoff to go through it and get filtered, even if it's not a full-blown design green infrastructure facility. This is one of the office complexes in the city. Same bioretention planters 16 years later, and still going strong. So, we go out, we inspect, we find these gems, and then you use them as inspiration that these things do last and they do work. And no, you don't have to spend millions trying to maintain them. Sac State bioretention planters, that was the Prop 84 grant project that we did with Sac State. Maureen managed the project, and it ended up being an absolute awesome project. So please go out and visit when you have a chance. Finally, this is the California Lottery Building here in downtown. At East 10th Street, it has planters as well as disconnected roof drains that goes to vegetated areas around the building. And then even the landscape areas that don't have swales and planters actually make use of, they make the runoff from the walkways go there. The CN Avenue Green Street, and I'm done. Okay, sorry. For the Home Depot, Walmart of the world that do execute a maintenance agreement, we don't. That's just part of the expectation that they will somehow figure a way to make sure they maintain the measures. We don't, get too into the details about financial funding for that. For the larger projects, like a large subdivision project, where it would be HOA maintained, for example, we did have a couple of city subdivisions where we do collect some backup money in the CFD to make sure that we will have access to that money if needed to help with the maintenance. It's case by case.